name's Harvey.
Hey, I'm Mahika.
Hey, I'm Adi.
And I'm James.
And our group decided to tackle the topic of youth enfranchisement. And we tackled this with the research question of, should the voting age be lowered to 16? And we answered this with the answer of, the voting age, yes, should be lowered to the age of 16, based off of these 4 points. 1, the development has begun earlier. 2, teens are more politically active than normal. Voting is a democratic obligation. And finally, the voting age is ineffective in itself. And moving on to the first piece of evidence, development has begun earlier. Now, Elizabeth Seaton, a curator at Kansas State University, finds the age of the first menstruation has dropped at least 2 years since the beginning of this century. And for boys, the American Academy of Pediatrics has found boys in the US are experiencing the onset of puberty almost 2 years earlier than reported in previous research, which leads me to the conclusion that young adults are developing 2 years earlier, and in relation, the voting age should be lowered 2 years. Now, I know exactly what you're thinking. A lot of people are like, 16-year-olds, they're not mature enough to make this decision. It's such an important decision. You can't do this. Well, actually, Joshua Douglas, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, finds there are 2 types of decision-making. There's hot decision and cold decision-making. And well, with hot cognition, basically, it's decisions that you make under pressure with your feelings that are in the spur of the moment that you gotta make it. And this ability doesn't fully develop until the age of 21 or 25 for males. But for cold cognition, it's a different story. There is no social pressures. There is nothing that is influencing you, and that you can approach this decision in a very methodical manner. And well, I find another conclusion that although teens are not good enough to make hot decisions, teens have the competency to make cold decisions, because cold decisions actually fully develop until the age of 16. And it stays fully developed for the rest of your life. And voting, guess what, is a cold decision. Now I leave more evidence to my friend over here, Mahika.
So the popular belief right now is that teens are not politically active and that they don't care enough about local, state, and national policies and politics. But if you look at Debbie Rocker, who's an author and researcher at the National Institute of Health and Family Welfare, she states that 70% of teens have signed petitions about the proposal of new laws, and 48% of teens have campaigned about something in local areas. So this shows that teens are politically active and have high voluntary political passion, contribution, and experience. And this political passion continues to grow, probably because many heavily debated political issues today affect teens directly. If you look at gun control or abortion, that affects teens. So this picture are students of Stoneman Douglas High School after surviving a school shooting. And after they survived, they became strong advocates for gun reform. They wrote op-eds, they organized rallies across the country, and they were able to pressure the Florida government and Governor Rick into passing the Stoneman Douglas School Safety Bill into law. And this is just one example of teens being politically active and being able to pass their beliefs into politics. So lowering the voting age ensures that the interests of young citizens are represented in the political system, and it ensures why 16-year-olds should be allowed to vote. I pass our next piece of evidence to Adi.
Thank you, Mahika, for that incredible segue. Now, my point is that voting is a democratic obligation. I know what a lot of you may be thinking. Nowhere does it say that voting is a right granted to all American citizens. Many of you may be thinking that voting is a privilege. But we must realize that the reason voting rights are withheld from 16-year-olds is because they are considered incompetent, a point that Harvey's already previously addressed. But we must realize that, as said by Timothy Fowler, a PhD in political philosophy from the University of York, denying a group of people voting rights solely based on an assumption of their capacity undermines the central liberal commitment of political equality. We must realize that time and time again, this has been proven true. From African Americans to women to 18-year-olds, the United States has an ugly record of unjust disenfranchisement. Maura Priest, a professor of philosophy at Arizona State University, argues that in this similar sense, 16-year-olds should also be granted the precious right to vote. The enfranchisement of 16-year-olds is in direct correlation to the preservation of American democracy in the future. It ensures that our children, when they grow up, have a voice in their governments and can do what they want in a democratic society. If America claims to be a democracy, then 16-year-olds should be able to vote. I must explain that while this, moral argument can also be applied to babies and toddlers, like why can't babies also go to the polls if they're born in America and are American citizens, we must realize that 16 is around the perfect age where, teens have reached maturity. And this point has been elaborated on by my fellow friend Harvey. Therefore, after giving my point about how democracy, it is, a responsibility for citizens to voice their opinions, I'll now pass on the torch to my fellow teammate, James.
Thank you. So my point is that the voting age is ineffective. And to expand, I mean that it fails in its purpose, and the purpose of the voting age is to eliminate incompetent voters. And by incompetent, I mean people that are politically uneducated, so people that vote for who's the most popular in their hometown, or who they see most on social media, so people who make uneducated political decisions. But the voting age fails in doing this because there are still incompetent voters that are adults, and there are actually competent voters that are children that are not allowed to vote currently. And Philip Cook, who is a professor of public policy at Duke University, states that a minimum voting age should be rejected because its view of competency is unreasonably controversial. And by this, he's basically expanding upon what I just said regarding how age and maturity do not actually coincide, and teenagers actually do have the capability to make politically educated decisions. I mean, teenagers, when you're 16, you can pay taxes, you can drive, you're already economically contributing to society, so why should you not be able to do so politically as well? I'm going to pass it to you here for this solution.
So for our solution, we have to look at some pros and cons. So pros were that, you have to consider that you want teens to have consistent voting habits, you want them to have good voting habits, but you also don't want too big of a consequence if they're not capable and they don't vote correctly. So considering all of these pros and cons, the best and most effective solution would be to slowly integrate 16-year-olds into local and state elections first, before seeing how that goes, before integrating them into national elections. And this ensures that youth voter turnout is high and teens are increasing their participation. Some cities in America, like Tacoma Park in Maryland, is already doing this, and they're seeing a lot of benefits. This solution obviously has limitations and implications.
Yeah, while our solution, was fantastic, there are going to be some limitations and implications that we must take a look at. The first of which being time-consuming integration. Historically, political transitions have been lengthy processes. Take a look at racial integration, for example. We're from the beautiful state of South Carolina, but our very own Greenville County did not integrate until 1970. Some states in the Deep South took even longer. Therefore, we concluded that expanding voting rights to 16-year-olds, even on a local scale, is going to take numerous years. Furthermore, the generations are changing. Certain evidence used in our argument only applies to this current generation of 16-year-olds. Take a look at the massive difference between the baby boomer generation and our current generation Z. There's no guarantee that future generations are going to fall under the same category. We must realize that as technology progresses, as mindsets change, people are going to change as well, and there's no guarantee that this same conclusion can be reached to in the near future. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and here are our works cited.
Give one specific way that your thinking changed as a result of learning about Mahika's findings.
So, I personally did not believe that teens were as politically active as as Mahika first introduced. But taking a look, further into her IRR and stuff, I realized that that is the case. Looking at teens around me, I never really was able to grasp that. And I consider myself to be very much politically active because I like talking about politics and such. But after reading about what Mahika researched, it's pretty clear that it's not just me, but it's my entire generation that is becoming more politically active, and that is the thing that I actually like to see, because by then our solution also makes sense, and it's bright for the future of American democracy.
Good, thank you. Harvey, describe how the content of the team presentation was changed as a result of group discussion.
Initially, we wanted to just lower the voting age to 17, and then I put out my research and I was like, hey, actually we're fully matured by 16, and so we decided, hey, let's change it, and we changed it only to 16. And then from there, we started discussing more, and Mahika found a pro-con website, and that gave us a lot of information on that viewpoint, and that was the moment we found this pro-con website and we agreed with the pros, we decided, hey, this is the research question we want, and we should lower to 16, and we stuck with that and wrote our IRRs on that.
Okay, great, thank you. Mahika, what is an example of a compelling argument from one of your peers' individual reports that you all decided to exclude?
So Harvey had a really good point about political affiliations and how like political parties affect teens and which way teens usually lean. And I feel like that would have been something that we could have further addressed or further researched, but we had to exclude it because it didn't really fit into our solution and our thesis or like our main claim. But with more time, I think we would have gone that route.
Okay, thank you. James, reflecting on your colleagues' work, which one had the greatest impact on your overall understanding of your team's problem?
So the one that the research that had the most impact on our team's problem was definitely Harvey's, because he talked about how hot and cold decisions, and how we initially, I think, all believed that cold decisions were not something that we're capable of that teens were capable of making. We couldn't make calculated decisions or politically educated decisions. But when he figured out, based off of the research about how teens are actually capable of making cold decisions, that affected our whole solution, because then we realized at that point that we were going to